Okay, is everybody here for the podcast session? Good. That's good because you're in the right place. Okay, so who in here would consider themselves a podcast fanatic? Who listens to podcasts? Okay, great. And we'll do this kind of back and forth here at the beginning. Why don't you shout out some of your favorite content that you like to get from your podcasts? Just call it. Doesn't matter if you talk about news, sports. Okay. Some true crime, maybe. Okay, great.
Awesome.
Okay.
Cool. How many of y'all have a podcast in your district right now? Anybody? Okay. Everybody north of the wall? Game of Thrones, thank you.
Yeah. Didn't work.
I just came up with that one about 3 minutes ago. All right. So, I'm Justin Deering. She didn't introduce herself.
I didn't. I should have. I'm Erin McCann. I'm the Director of Communications in Crandall ISD.
I'm Justin Deering. I'm the Assistant Director of Communications in Carroll ISD in Southlake, right basically next to DFW Airport. If you've ever flown into that airport, all your planes flew over our stadium right before they landed. And if you looked out, you saw a huge dragon. We're the Dragons. And we can see the neighboring district from our football stadium. And I mean, that's kind of, if you talk about Southlake, Carroll a lot, you hear a lot about the Dragons, football team, sports, and things like that. So this is my daughter. I recently went to a keynote about an hour and 15 minutes ago, and they told me that I should open my presentation with a story. So I walked in and told Erin that we were going to change the first 5 slides of our presentation, and she looked at me like, "You are dead to me." All right.
It's going really well.
So I have been an active podcaster since about 2006, 2007. I was a teacher at a high school in Texas that had a radio station, and they allowed me to record in the studio after hours as long as I turned off the transmitter and didn't broadcast out our show to the world. And as long as we just put it on a little SD card and then loaded it to iTunes, back when it took a month and a half to get approved and then a week and a half to post an episode. And then after that, I went into a bunch of other podcasts, and I currently have 1, 2, maybe 3 coming up going on right now. But I spend more time than I should producing a podcast for an 11-person team fantasy baseball league. I spend about 3 to 4 hours a week producing a podcast for 12 people to listen to. The return on investment is very high. So I'm in there working, looking at stats, editing together intros, all this stuff that, again, 12 people are going to listen to. And Kinley comes in and says, "Dad, you work a lot about baseball." And I said, "Yeah." She goes, "Does anybody even listen to it?" She's 6, and she's in that phase where she's smarter than anybody else in the house. And every time we say something, she looks at us like we're just not there, don't know what we're talking about. And she goes, "Dad, I should have a podcast." And I said, "You should." So I put a headphone on her and gave her a microphone right after she went through Rachel's challenge. If anybody knows what Rachel's challenge is at her school, I just sat down and said, "Okay, Kinley, you're in kindergarten. What does kindness mean?" She went off for 10 minutes. "Okay, Kinley, what does it mean to be nice to your friends, to be nice to your teachers, that kind of thing?" She went off, and I edited it down to 3 minutes. I mean, if you listen to it ever, if I can show you where it's at sometime. I didn't put it on iTunes. I didn't put on anything. The baseball podcast gets 12 listens a week, guaranteed. This one 5-minute conversation with my 6-year-old has over 4,000 plays, and I've never once marketed it. I put it on Twitter. Some of y'all have seen it on Twitter. I've posted it a couple times. But for some reason, this little kid's voice is important enough for people to listen to. Not my baseball stats I spent 4 hours on, but it ended with a really bad joke that she came up with on her own. But her voice was important enough to have people listen to it. That's kind of why I'm passionate about podcasting. On the personal side, I like talking about sports. I like talking about TV shows. I like talking about, me and my best friend have a show where we're both approaching 40, and we're talking about how different it is as him as a single man, me with kids, what's it like to turn 40, and blah, 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 whatever. But more people have listened to my 6-year-old talk about kindness than they have any other show we've ever done. Carroll ISD, like I said, is located in Southlake, Texas. We are 2 very different districts, but we're very close together. So we see, with Southlake, we have 11 campuses, 8,400 students, and we are kind of landlocked in. We're not going to grow much past that. There's a little bit of wiggle room. And we see that we have a lot of commuters. We have a lot of stay-at-home moms that The commuters are leaving and going to Dallas, or leaving and going to Fort Worth, or going to Irving, and those are all 25 to 30-minute drives in all directions. So we're seeing that that's an opportunity to reach them because they may not be following us on Twitter. They may not, that's 25 minutes, 30 minutes a day that they're available. So we're seeing that that may be a spot that we can grab them. I'm talking about Granville.
So Justin talked about how if you fly into DFW, you're flying over Carroll ISD. It's a pretty big district. In contrast, I'm probably the only person in this room who has any idea where Crandall ISD is. It's teeny, teeny, tiny. We're more of a rural district that's sort of slowly becoming suburban. Carroll ISD is much more of an urban suburban district. But we're growing too, and so that made this podcasting session perfect for us to talk about, because with two very different districts, different demographics, but both growing dramatically in student size, we needed to talk about, is this an effective way that we can be reaching our families and telling our stories? Oh, sorry. Okay, so just a couple quick stats on some of our social media following, just to show again the difference between our two districts.
So again, the hashtag for this session is NSPRA podcasting. It's the longest hashtag in the seminar this week. We wanted it to be memorable and that you have to type it a bunch. As we go on, please get your phone out, take pictures. I enjoy getting my picture taken. Post it on Twitter. If I say something that changes your life, I'm Deering 22. If Aaron says something that changes your life, I'm Deering 22. Please feel free to tag me in all quotes that are good. It's okay. If you knew that 20 to 25% of your audience was on a platform, would you use it? A quarter of your audience is using a platform. Okay, good. Because I bet most of you are using Twitter. That's where there's statistics right now show that 20 to 25% of people are using Twitter. They're showing that 39% of the households of the parents your age are listening to podcasts, at least one in the last month. For the Canadians, it's 36% are listening to them in the last month. So there's more people actively saying they're actively listening to podcasts than they are the 25%, 20 to 25% on Twitter. 51% of homes would say that they are podcast fans. I think my house would say we are podcast super fans. My wife listened to the murder podcast.
My Favorite Murder.
My Favorite Murder. And she listened to like episode 172 and was like, holy crap. And has now backlogged and listened to every episode. And she'll get in the car with our beautiful 6-year-old daughter who likes to listen to kindness stuff and talk about kindness. And she'll be like, oh no, My Favorite Murder's on. And if you listen to that, it's F-bombs galore sometimes. And she's never seen a woman disconnect her Bluetooth as fast as she does in that situation. There are 700,000 active podcasts out there right now with over 29 million episodes. That tells me that there's 29 million opportunities for people to use their voice and to be heard and for a story to be told. Again, the keynote just said it's all about stories. She connected with us based on stories. I think that a podcast is a great opportunity for a district to share information, obviously, but more importantly, to tell the stories of who's in the classroom up at the front, in the chairs, who's sweeping the classroom after the day is over, who's preparing the lunch. Those people have stories that need to be told as well.
I think Justin might have neglected to mention that you can tag me on Twitter at MickAaron2006. Feel free on everything. Okay, so this is NSPRA. We're obviously going to use a little bit of strategy here. So we're going to do the RPI method, research. Okay, how do you know if you even need a podcast in your district? Maybe you want to jump on the bandwagon because it's trendy, everybody's doing it, you think it's kind of cool or fun. Maybe your superintendent has tasked you with starting a podcast because your superintendent has noticed that all of their superintendent peers are doing a podcast, so you need to do one too. You've got to start with the why you're doing this. None of those reasons are wrong. You just need to know what your end goal is and why you're starting that way. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later, but a perfect example of this is a couple of years ago, I started a podcast for Crandall ISD, CISD, and there was no strategy behind it. It was kind of one of those, I wanted to experiment with some sound equipment. I wanted to see if we even had a market for it because we are such a small suburban or urban district that doesn't really commute. So it was just kind of that, throw everything at the wall, see what sticks. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Oh, I lost the clicker. Okay, so that leads me to, will a podcast work in every single community? No, it won't, but that's why we do our research on the community. before we even get to the microphone at all. So who is a podcaster? Who's even listening on the on-demand section? Okay. Okay, we're going to take a brief look at some of the profiles of a podcast listener. So 54% of those are male and 46% of those are female. You've got a pretty big breakdown in your age bracket. 12 to 24 is about 40% of your listening audience, with 25 to 54 being 39%. 34% of podcast listeners are non-white. 41% of monthly podcast listeners have a household income over $75,000. 51% are employed full-time, and 25% of U.S. podcasters have a 4-year college degree. But more important than any of those statistics is that podcast fans are loyal. If they come back to hear more of your stories, you now have a new brand ambassador. So Justin talked a little bit about the My Favorite Murder and how addicted his wife got. That's absolutely true. People will pay to go sit in a room and listen to two women talk about mass murder. They call that a good time.
I bought my wife Hamilton tickets for Christmas, and it was $97. But to send her to My Favorite Murder was $197, so she got to go to Hamilton. She was just as excited, but still was kind of slightly disappointed she didn't get to go watch two women talk about mass murder.
I know on my own, I'm a huge King Falls AM podcast fan. I absolutely love their content. So with my own money, on my own dime, I went and bought a t-shirt and I subscribed to them on Patreon just because I like their creativity. I want to be a supporter of their arts. And I'd like to apologize to my husband, who happens to be in the room, because he is now finding out with the rest of you where all of our money is going. So I'm so sorry, Kevin. Everybody's got their own favorite genre. We talked about that at the beginning. Some of you said sports, some of you said news, some of you said true crime. And there's kind of a space for every one of those niches, and you've got to figure out for your district, where does that work? It's important as well to think about the length of the podcast that you're putting out. Some people just want to get on the microphone and talk forever, and that doesn't really work. Research is showing us that the longer your podcast runs, the less likely your listener will be to finish that episode. There's one podcast I absolutely love. It's another true crime one, but their episodes are typically an hour and a half in length, and they put one out every single week. So I find myself backburnering that content, because when do I have an hour and a half in one sitting to just sit and listen to a podcast? Then you jump in halfway through, you don't really remember what the beginning of the episode was about, and you lose your audience. So that 15 to 25 minute mark is really kind of your sweet spot. That's not to say you can never go over, especially if your episode is particularly engaging, but the shorter has kind of worked out, the better. Okay, so what's the point of your podcast? You've started thinking about why you want to do it. What's the point? There's a couple different ways. You can go strictly informational, which works for a lot of your smart audio. It might work well in your district for like morning announcements, key dates, typical district information. Or are you going more on the interview-based storytelling brand? That's what we talked about this morning, right? We opened with why you should be telling the stories of your district and how you can start with a story and everyone's automatically wrapped up in that. If you go more interview-based, you're more likely to do some brand building and maybe create new ambassadors for your district.
Back on this one here, on strictly informational, just think if you're getting up, if it's like it is in my house, every day at about 6:15, the question comes out is, what are we having for lunch today? 6:15 in the morning. And it would be real nice to be able to go, hey Alexa, what are they having at Old Union? And then the superintendent's voice or the principal's voice pops up and says, today at Old Union's lunch is chicken fried steak and square pizza, or whatever it is that day. Because then she can say, I'm in, or she can say, I'm out, and we can say, you're in, because it's 6:15 in the morning, we're not making lunch right now. But that's areas, even though it's not a traditional podcast, it's not going on iTunes or Spotify or one of those hosts, that audio style content can be used elsewhere. And there's easy classes out there that show you how to build that. That's a different presentation some other time, but smart speakers, smart systems like that are something that we probably should be paying attention to, because they're everywhere and they're in everybody's house. So now you've decided it's go time, our community looks good for it, or you've decided our community doesn't look good for it, but I really want to be a podcaster because that's a cool thing that people have on their Twitter account right now. Mine says wannabe podcaster, but we're getting there. So you're planning, you need to look at it strategically again. First and foremost, and I think she's still in the room and she'll be very proud of me for saying this, does a podcast line up with your strategic plan? If it doesn't line up with your strategic plan, then stop right there and figure out something that does. For us in Carroll ISD, one of our big movements in our strategic plan is giving students a voice. I don't think there's anything other than interviewing students that lines up pretty perfectly with that section of the strategic plan, is let them talk and tell their story. That's what they want to do. Budgetarily, you can honestly get by doing a podcast with this right here. There's apps now that will say, press here to record, press here to publish, and now you're a podcaster. Now you can go out and you can get a ton of equipment for $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, build a soundproof booth in your district, or you can go to Amazon and get a $12 plug-in lavalier mic, and it'll work too. Now granted, as you get better, as you get more people listening, as you start to see a return, you're going to want to up your game. But I would not go out and drop $3 or $4 grand until you've tested to make sure it's going to work, because then that equipment's going to get dusty real quick when no one's listening. On your handout, there is a QR code. Which color is that? The yellow QR code. If you scan that, it will take you to a website called Kit. There's a beginner's kit, an intermediate kit, an advanced kit. Shows you everything you need to start a podcast. If you didn't get a handout, there's some more up here we can give out in a little bit. But I built kits there that show you kind of what, if I was just starting out with one, I just want to go USB mic, there's a great mic to get. So that's available there for you as well. And then hosting. The cool thing is, 7-8 years ago when we did this, you had to buy a website, you had to host it there, you had to get an RSS feed. You had to load it to iTunes, you had to pay the monthly rate to keep your website alive. And there was so much stuff you had to do. Now there's apps that will do it for free. There are apps that will do it and give you a little bit more ability to do some advertising or things like that for a little bit per month. And then there's still obviously the ones out there that cost way more than they should because technology has advanced. But then finally, the biggest thing is we only have so many hours in the day that we can work. It's usually 10 to 15. But if you have a podcast, you're going to be at 16. Make sure it is something you want to do that works for your district, because if it's something that's just another task, it's not going to be as good as it's going to be. If it's something you're passionate about, if you're passionate about your students telling their story, you're passionate about hearing why your teachers come to work every day, and you're seeing a return, it's only going to get better from there.
Yeah, podcasting really is a labor of love activity. If it's, like you said, one of those checklist items, you can hear that in someone's voice, and you're not going to buy engagement with that.
Question.
So, yes.
The apps that you just mentioned, are they part of one of those QR codes?
Yes, and we're about there.
We're going to talk about that too.
Spoiler alert. Yeah. So when I first started my podcast forever ago, it was, like I said, a website. You took the RSS feed, you turned it into iTunes. They waited a month to approve you, then you finally started to show up, and that first episode you did a month ago no longer makes sense because it's a month later. Now SoundCloud, if you record and edit, you go onto SoundCloud. It is free. I will give you a heads up on SoundCloud. You can't really control the other stuff on SoundCloud.
Right.
When I was a teacher, we would live stream our radio shows on Ustream, and we marked them educational. That did not stop Coors Light, Bud Light, and Miller Lite from being the side panel, and there was nothing I could do about that.
Right.
Or another educational how to roll a joint video was tagged to ours, so that was one that we can't really take care of. So we immediately came off of Ustream. This is when I was teaching in a different district. Sorry, Julie. It was not Carroll ISD. It was a different district. But my favorite, and the one that I use for everything, is Anchor. Audio Boom, I skipped over that. It's $15 a month. They have quite a bit of options. Erin's used it before more than me, so she can talk more about Audio Boom if you want to talk about it. But Anchor.fm is an app on your phone. You can record on your phone, or you can record in the studio, edit it, and throw it up. And within minutes, you have an episode at least on Anchor, and then within the next day or two, you will have, maybe even hours or two, you'll have it on all the other platforms.
And it's completely free.
And yeah, 100% free. And if you're doing a personal podcast, they will let you advertise Anchor, obviously, and they'll give you money for it, but they will also look at your stats and who's listening, and they will suggest advertisers and send, hey, Casper Mattress would like to be an advertiser on your, and everybody knows about Casper because they're on every podcast right now. So you record a commercial, and you're now sponsored by Casper. This is, now that you're going to do this, this is the 5 steps that I try to go through when I start one. We're in the middle of starting ours at Carroll ISD. This projector I was hoping would be way bigger, so I know people in the back cannot see it, but if you scan that second QR code, it'll take you to a folder that has the slides in it already for you. So the first thing, basic show structure. When it comes to, I like a lot of professional development podcasts as well as sports podcasts. Let's just turn it on, let's just get to the information. But professional development style or storytelling style podcast, I enjoy, when I click on it, kind of hearing what I'm getting myself into. Because I can tell in the first couple minutes if I hear a review or I hear a recap of what's coming up, who we're interviewing, why they're getting interviewed. That is something I can tell, do I want to keep going and devote the next hour of my life to this, or do I want to kind of back off and find something else? Shane is in the room. Shane, you do a great job on your podcast, letting us know what we're getting into, and usually I always stick around for it, so thank you. And it is Breaker Society, just so everybody knows.
And I didn't pay him to say
I told my son, hey, you're going to shout out, come. He's like, I'll be there. So
He's a sponsor of this session.
yes, this one has been brought to you by Breaker Society. Tune in on all major platforms. All right, so who's hosting? If you have a superintendent that can sit down and have a conversation and you just listen, that's a perfect host.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have a superintendent that may be really good strategically, but maybe not relationally, some of us have those, you may want to look at maybe a strong student hosting. That would be a powerful thing, or a strong teacher, or you. Because y'all use your voice a lot, so why not use it again and be on the podcast host? There's nothing, you've got a lot of time in the day to add a podcast and be the host, so just, that's the route to take. If no one else is doing it, it's you, it's your turn. And then who are you interviewing? This is kind of everything you just heard for the last hour and 15 minutes of how to find a story. Just go back to her notes and listen to what she said, and go find those stories and put a mic in front of them.
Right.
And then I would say that the next big thing is marketing. When we got accepted to do this, we immediately were like, we got to start putting some stuff out so people will show up. And we have people in the hallway, so thank you for coming.
We appreciate you.
I would say always, before you launch a podcast, you want to have 4 to 5 shows in the can. That means
Yeah.
ready to go, because we live in a binge society
Yes.
where Stranger Things comes out on Saturday night and we are done by Sunday afternoon.
Yes.
But if you give them one piece of content, it may be the best show you've ever done, and they get done, and they go to another show, and they have 5 shows, you just got forgotten.
Yeah. They'll never come back to you.
Give them 4 to 5 shows off the launch. That's
That's just what I was gonna say. So you would recommend when you launch it with.
All the same day, a couple episodes.
And I would, some people say roll them out an hour apart. I say hit all 5 of them at one time.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you roll that first one out and we do a recap at the beginning, maybe you click in, you hear your superintendent's voice, it's a recognizable voice, but maybe it's a parent who had an issue with the person he's interviewing. Well, I'm out. But if there's 4 other episodes, maybe I'll click on the second one and listen to that. And then get them going so they know what to expect from you. They know where it's going. They know they're going to get good stories. And then at the end, they're going to hear Don't Forget Homecoming's next week, probably. But before that, they're going to get a lot of good information. Load it up early and get as many shows available as you can. No more than probably 5, but 4 to 5 off the jump will get you a following quick. And then ask them, hey, tell your friends, share it. At the
Please
same time,
subscribe.
yeah, please subscribe, smash that like button, all the YouTube things. You'll start getting a following there, but you need to do on your side, you need to do the marketing, you need to do show notes. Some people don't like listening to podcasts, but that story needs to be told to them, so there's places you can get transcripts of podcasts, turn that into an article, into a blog, into little quote cards on Instagram. There's programs that you can load the audio in and they'll automatically do the soundy, cool looking wave thing, and you post that as an Instagram post, and now you're drawing attention to it. Everything leads back to that podcast. Everything leads back to the story of your district. And then finally, so we'll go to this one.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Okay, so in that context, I'm trying to visualize how you get people to listen to it. And so, let's say you're marketing, you're promoting it, so I've got it on Facebook, I've got it in 4 or 5 places, and they come across that at 9 o'clock in the morning on their phone or something like that. So, they're not likely going to listen to it then. So, how do you get them to go back when they're driving back the next day? Now, you see what I'm saying? In other words, generally speaking, when they first hear about it, usually isn't where they're going to, unless you're sitting at home at night by themselves, they're just not going to turn on and access a podcast. So, how do you make that connection between the two? Or what do you recommend? Because
I would say there's another you could, obviously your first, I didn't say this, but your first little episode that you've released, you could do a trailer.
Yeah.
A short 3-minute max. Someone will listen to 2 to 3 minutes.
I put that on Twitter.
And put that on Twitter, put that as your first episode on iTunes. When you open it up, the first thing's a little 3-minute recap. This is what you're going to get, and you're going to see it. You can put it as, you can make a little video about it. You can use audio and just blitz it. I mean, if you're going to launch it and spend the time on it, it's one of those projects that's worth pushing out multiple social media posts. It shouldn't be a one and done. Like, hey, we're doing a podcast.
Yeah, you fall into the
Hey,
Twitter
we're on
abyss.
episode 45. Thanks for listening. Like that, it shouldn't be like that. It should be, and I'll show you a little bit more here in just a second in this section about like keeping it alive and keeping it growing.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm asking.
Yeah. So the fun part's over with. You've recorded, you've done the editing, and you're ready to go. And now you're thinking, I've got to actually put this thing out. The hardest part is to actually put it out. It may sound good in your head, but everybody, like this presentation sounded really good in my head. And there's people here going, this thing is not that great. But you just got to publish it, you just got to put it out, and just see what happens. The hardest part is hitting submit. But once you hit submit, it's gone. And you can pull it back, but it's still going to be out there for a couple days, and then it'll finally come back. But just publish it. If you use Anchor, just realize if you checked all the boxes, it's everywhere. If you don't want it everywhere, you just want it to live on iTunes, make sure you pay attention to the settings. Because it's one of those opt-out more than opt-in. You don't click each one. It says, if there is a platform you don't want it on, click here. And then all the platforms pop up. So if you just fly through setting up Anchor, it's everywhere.
It automatically creates that RSS feed for you and then automatically distributes it for you. So you have to choose where you don't want it to go, basically.
So now it's out, and everybody's listening. So let's say your first episode, this is kind of a example, is what they call it. Your superintendent does his first back-to-school episode and introduces the year's theme, interviews the new athletic director, and announces a new district initiative focusing on equality and diversity. That is your pillar content. That's where you want everybody to come back to. Okay, that's what you want them to hear. That's what you want them to grasp onto and grab little nuggets out of there. So you're going to reproduce maybe powerful quotes that are within that. Those become the tweets. Those become the graphics on Instagram. Those become little blog posts or things like that throughout your social network that you're using. And then you're going to shut up and listen. And you're just going to see what they do with it. Okay? Everybody do with pictures? Here we go. This is a confusing slide. It took me a long time to make, so please love it. All right, so your pillar content goes out on every platform out there. If I were you and you have the budget, I would set cameras up and record these podcasts on video as well. Because that's very easy video content to use. So maybe you put the podcast on Anchor, you put it on YouTube, Vimeo, all over the podcast place. All the places it's going to be, it's there, right? And then you start breaking it down individually. You grab that picture of the athletic director and you grab the quote that he says of, this coach when I grew up influenced my entire life. And then that's shared out with who influenced your life. Be sure to listen to Coach whatever, talk about why he chose to be an athletic director and share that across everything. Okay, then you go over on LinkedIn, you go into Medium, you go into everywhere, put it on your blog sites, put it on your news sites, get those transcripts, turn it into an article. Now you've put out a bunch of content everywhere, you've put up micro content as your social media stuff. Now you're shutting up and listening. Okay, so now you're looking and you're seeing, they're really grasping onto this diversity and this diversity section that the superintendent's talked about. We need to revisit that. So you go back to it, you pull different things from your podcast. You recreate Twitter posts. You create blog posts. You do an extended interview with the superintendent or with someone in the district if you have somebody who's working exclusively on that project for inclusion and equity and diversity. And you go in and you get that person, you extend it. But at the end, where does it lead back to? Your podcast. It always leads back to your pillar content. You'll see that podcast will come out. You'll get hit. It'll slow down. But then when it's slowing down, you're listening. And then when it gets down to once it's slowed down a little bit, and you re-release it, it will reboost. Because the majority of this is not going to be, it's a lot of evergreen type of things you want to continue to hear. You don't want to be like, let's talk to the homecoming queen about why was today the best day of your life. Because tomorrow it's old. You want these things to be like, why do we do what we do? Why am I important to this district? Why are you important to this district? Tell those stories. Revisit everything. If you haven't heard of Gary Vee, he has a huge blog on this. It's amazing. Get past all the F words. I'm sorry, I didn't condone it, but he does cuss a lot. but he gets his point across. He's made a lot of money in this industry, and he knows what he's talking about. So I would check out his content model. Water.
Okay, so you've researched it to death, you've planned it, you've implemented it, and now you've launched it. Congratulations, you are now a podcaster. But before you start celebrating, you have to look back critically and think, did this work? Okay, so PodTrack is a really easy, quick way to start tracking your analytics if you want to function outside of something like iTunes or some of these built-in measurements. This is just a quick graphic showing you the top 10 podcast creators. And now it's time for a little bit of shameless promotion. All right, I'd like to apologize in advance. This is my personal podcast. This is not my district podcast, but it's also the best example of metrics that I can share with you from my own experience. About a year and a half ago, my cousins and I started a podcast about superstitions, the history of superstitions. And we've had sort of, I would say, like a medium amount of success. In a year and a half, we have about 7,000 downloads. We're not breaking the bank, we're not going on tour, but it's enough to keep us going. So when we did this, we kind of came up with the idea at Thanksgiving one year, and we ran headfirst into creating content because it was fun. There wasn't a lot of strategy behind it. But as we've kept growing and we've taken a better critical look at some of our analytics, we've started making changes and we've started listening to our listeners and kind of creating that two-way dialogue that we know is so important. And some of these include taking topic suggestions, and then that listener gets their name shouted out, which means that they share it with all of their friends because their name has now been shared on iTunes. Receiving listener gifts, opening them on air, sharing that person who sent the gifts. You've now created a new brand ambassador for you. And trying to make changes based on some of that feedback. Maybe the volume was a little bit low in some of our early episodes. Maybe the length was a little bit too long. We kind of talked about that earlier on. And then working harder not to interrupt and talk over each other, but continue that engagement. With 3 hosts, that can be really difficult. Really kind of your ideal is 2. There happen to be 3 of us. So we have to make a very concerted effort to make sure that everyone has a chance to speak, but that we're not running over each other. Or in the case of some of my episodes, I tend to monologue a little bit and don't leave a lot of space for that engagement. So did we meet our goal? Well, technically, yes, because our goal was to create something, spend time together, have a good time, and not spend any of our own money. So yes, we make just enough money off of our advertising and our Patreon donors to continue the project, not pay out of pocket, and we're getting ready to upgrade our equipment. I would say yes, it's a success. But if the goal was to make this my retirement fund and not see any of you at NSPRA next year, then I probably have a long way to go. So for schools, it's probably a little bit of a different goal, right? You're trying to create some brand ambassadors. You're not really worried about making money off your podcast. I mean, maybe you are if you've got a sponsorship agreement. But it's really more about inspiring change and building that brand.
I'd say on that as well, if you look at what we do every day, and kind of like, again, referring back to the keynote earlier, we are telling the good stories that happen in our district. And I always look at it kind of like we're filling up our emergency account. We're filling up that, so when we're putting good stories in there, filling up the bank account so that when the flat tire happens on all 4 tires at once, we're not completely stranded. We have a reputation that people hold on to, and one big catastrophic emergency or one bad press release or one bad news story on Channel 4 doesn't just completely kill the identity of your brand and the reputation of your schools. And I think this is just another avenue of building that. So I think if you can tell the stories that, you know, trigger people and get people into a point where they're like, this is awesome, they're doing such good things in that district, you're building, like Aaron said, you're building ambassadors. But those ambassadors, once you see those people who are responding, you need to bring them in to be like legit brand ambassadors. Like once you release a podcast, they know they need to go share the podcast. The people on My Favorite Murder, they are loyal. And they will send in murders for them to talk about, and they will research them and they will talk about those murders. But then when that episode comes out, they are, the amount of money those 2 women are making who started a podcast while they were at a random party, did not know each other, ran into each other, and started talking about murder, and were like, this is really cool. That's how that podcast started. It wasn't like a plan. It wasn't like we should talk about murder. It was like they were having a conversation. 2 of them were way too excited about the topic that was there and decided we should talk into a microphone, and here they are making 7 figures a year talking about murder.
Murder.
So they have loyal followers who every time, even if it's the worst show they've done, even if it's a, hey, this is the best show we did 5 years ago, let's listen to it again, they're still getting a ton of plays and their brand is there. And if they release a crap show, guess what? Their brand is still there. So if you can load up your emergency fund with all these good stories, including a podcast, to go along with your Twitter, to go along with your video, to go along with everything you're already doing, when that one story comes along that you think is just going to level it and you're going to have to start from scratch, and it did in our district this year. That story came this year for us. It was tough. But it did not, the response and the way they responded and everything, the reputation we already had, yeah, we took a hit, but we built back up way faster than we would have if we hadn't been doing the work in the front end.
And we didn't actually talk at all about a back catalog, which is just as you release more and more episodes. Justin talked about releasing kind of 3 to 5 from the get-go. As you buy in and create new listeners, as you move through this process, they're going to listen to an episode. Maybe it's Homecoming. Maybe it's something a little bit more evergreen, and they're like, oh, I kind of like that. Like, I didn't know Crandall had a podcast. I wonder what else is going on. They go back. The more back episodes you have, then you start to see new downloads. Then they share those. We all have our chat room champions in our district, right? Sometimes they work for us. Sometimes they work against us. If you bring those on as brand ambassadors, this is just one more tool and trick to get your district message out.